The Connaught was the height of luxury travel for her first-class passengers, and a way to start a new life in a new country for the many immigrants that boarded her in Galway, bound for Boston. A new ship only on her second voyage, and the second largest ship on the ocean, her passengers could be justified in thinking that they had chosen wisely for the safest and most comfortable voyage possible. When a terrible storm hit them, however, their voyage would turn into a daring rescue mission.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the SS Connaught's race between fire and flood?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The SS Connaught was meant to sail at 20 knots, and the builder said that she should be able to make up to 22 knots. Never mind that at her trial run, she had only managed 15.5. This was written off by her builder, J.B. Palmer, as being a fault of her machinery being too new. She was placed into service anyway under her new owners, the Atlantic Royal Mail Steam Company. Her first voyage was marred, however, when only a few yards from the dock, a piston worked through one of the cylinder heads. All of her passengers and mail was transferred to a ship that was ready to sail, and she was repaired and gotten ready to leave again. This was still accepted as a not uncommon occurrence, though some pointed to it as a sign of poor workmanship and even poorer materials. It was also noted that she averaged less than 14 knots on her first voyage from Galway to Boston and then back, which was to be her new route. This in spite of the 3 engines driving her twin paddle wheels boasting of an aggregate 800 horsepower. It was true that the ship had 2 iron masts that rose above her deck, but these were mainly to give the ship steadiness. Her engines were meant to be a point of pride, but they had failed to impress. It might not have been an auspicious start, but much worse was to come. If people could criticize her engines, it was much harder to find fault with the rooms and amenities offered by the new passenger ship. She was the second largest ship in the world at 4,400 tons, falling behind only the Great Eastern in size. She was made completely of iron, with wood-paneled rooms, luxurious furnishings, and comfortable saloons. In total, a cost of £100,000 to build. Her owners meant to make this expenditure back quickly, however. Carrying immigrants from Ireland to New England was a lucrative business at the time. They calculated that she would have space for 700 passengers and 100 crew members. The start of the second voyage of the Connaught seemed more promising, and as though the initial engine difficulties that she had suffered had simply been growing pains, as the builders claimed. She left Galway on the 25th of September 1860, and after a stop in St. James, Newfoundland by October 5th, she was on her way to Boston with 50 first-class passengers, 417 steerage passengers, and a crew of 125 on board. Though the morning of the 5th started out pleasant, the wind started to pick up as the day went on, until finally it was a gale, and the ship was being buffeted by the sea. At around 8 o'clock that night came the word from the engine room that there was a leak, and the water was starting to come in. At first, this fact was hidden from the passengers due to the crew not wanting to alarm them. But it was hard to hide it for long, as the motion of the ship changed and the crew was seen whispering in groups. Captain Leitch acted quickly, and the engine pumps and the bilge injections were put into service, but it was quickly found that these were not enough to keep up with the water. All of the deck pumps were then also put into use, as were 2 portable fire engines. Still, the water was on the rise, and so a portion of the crew and passengers set to work bailing by hand. At first it seemed as though their efforts were being rewarded, and the water began to sink a little. But whether the crew got too exhausted to work as quickly, or the leak got larger, the water then began to rise again. This time, the water gained faster, and by 8 the next morning, the water had risen to a point where it had put out the forward boiler, and the ship started to slow. By 9 in the morning, everyone had been driven from below, and without anyone feeding the fire, the ship lost all steam. There was still hope placed in the masts, however, and the passengers believed that if the breeze would just stiffen in the right direction, they would still be able to reach Boston by that night, so long as the water could be kept at bay. Captain Leitch would later say that everyone on the ship worked together in the face of this disaster, and worked hard to follow his orders. Quiet was the overwhelming rule, both between the passengers and the crew, with hardly anyone feeling like saying much, as it became more and more certain that the water was winning on the ship. Bailing was slowing the inevitable, but it was clear the ship was in distress. At around 9 or 9:30, the engineer of the ship noted a new sign of distress, and ran to Captain Leitch with the news. He had seen smoke rising from the aft stockhole. He believed the ship might be on fire. All of the pumps that had been moved below deck were now ordered to the deck, and they began to gather buckets and wet blankets to fight the flames. Passengers and crew were united in the effort to prolong the ship's life as long as possible. How and when the fire started was never determined, though it originated at the aft boiler on the starboard side. Captain Leitch would later also say that he imagined that the fire had been burning for some time, considering its size, by the time they discovered it. With all of their time and energy directed towards trying to fight the water gaining on the ship, somehow, somewhere, a small flame had gone unnoticed until it was already too large to fight with just the simple methods they first attempted. Captain Leitch made a difficult decision. Rather than pumping out the ship, the pumps were now reversed to pump in, towards where the smoke was now starting to billow. With them no longer pumping out the ship, and pumping water into the ship was doing little to reduce the smoke, by 3 in the afternoon, Captain Leitch began to prepare for a future where they would have to leave the Connaught. He ordered that a distress flag be flown on each of the ship's masts, and one at the main gaff. He also ordered that the ship's boats begin to be launched. The seas were still so rough that the first boat that was launched was immediately smashed against the side of the Connaught, but the next 3 lifeboats were launched successfully, as were 4 other auxiliary boats that the ship had. A man had been sent up one of the masts to look for help, and around 5 that afternoon he shouted down that he could see 2 sets of sails, both heading to the north of them. The seas were still rough, and the first ship, a bark, failed to see them. But the second ship, a small brigantine, changed her course and headed in their direction. The Minnie Schiffer was returning from her first ever transatlantic voyage, with a cargo of fruit bound from Marseille to Boston under the command of Captain Wilson. The brigantine was a small and insignificant ship compared to the massive Connaught. Where the Connaught was over 4,000 tons, the Minnie Schiffer came in at only 194. Still, Captain Wilson ordered his ship to draw as near as was safe to the stricken Connaught, and stood by to render aid. The first 2 boats were immediately dispatched from the Connaught to the Minnie Schiffer, primarily full of women, while the crew and some of the passengers kept up the desperate fight against the growing inferno. At this point, it was a battle to buy time, as more of the passengers were lowered into the lifeboats. They could only manage a single rope on the weather side of the ship. The sea was so rough that when they tried to load people on the lee side, they were in danger of the ship crushing them. In the meantime, more and more water was employed to fight back the fire, and every aperture that could be found was covered, to try and deprive the fire of oxygen for as long as possible. As the first boats unloaded their passengers on the mini Schiffer and returned for more, a new problem arose. The iron on the hull of the weather side of the ship was now so hot that the iron was warping, driving everyone to the lee side of the ship. The deck was so warm it could be felt through the soles of the shoes of the people standing on it, and the pitch started to melt out of the seams of the deck. As the ship rolled, the sea water now hissed against her sides and caused steam to rise. They were at least able to continue the loading of the lifeboats, the seas having calmed enough that the lee side of the ship was now safe to launch from. It was still slow going enough that by nightfall, only 200 of the passengers from the Connaught had been transferred into the mini Schiffer, and things were becoming increasingly dangerous on the Connaught. Several of the boat's crew, on reaching the safety of the brigantine, refused to go back to the burning ship until Captain Wilson had made a bold promise. Unwilling to leave anyone to die in the blaze, he got the mini Schiffer almost alongside the large vessel and took a hawser from the Connaught to his little ship, thus giving the sailors a sense of security. Though the mini Schiffer was now also in some danger, this sped up the evacuation as well. By 9:30, all of the passengers had been evacuated, and only the crew remained on board the stricken steamer. The flames had now started to burst through the skylights, and the masts were ablaze as the ropes caught fire, as did the sail that had been set to keep the ship steady. With the passengers safe, they next sent off the mail, the only cargo of the ship to be saved, as well as some of the crew. Finally, around 10 o'clock at night, Captain Leitch and his first mate were standing alone on the deck, surrounded by flames. Though Captain Wilson sent a boat alongside to beg the two men to come away, neither did until they had done their best to ensure that no other living person was on board. Both men fought their way through the choking smoke and heat to look every place where a person might still be. Only then did they allow themselves to be taken to the mini Schiffer. As they stepped aboard the brigantine, the stark difference in size between the two vessels became all too clear. The 194-ton mini Schiffer had suddenly taken on 592 people that she was definitely not designed to hold. The women and children who first came on board were placed in the cabin, but after that became too full, an awning was built on deck for more of them. Every bit of standing room on the deck was taken up with people to the extent that it made it difficult for the ship to be sailed, while some of the men who had been rescued even took to the rigging as a place to stay as there was no deck available for them. Some of the ship boats that had been used in the rescue were now tied behind the small vessel, and even more of the people who had been rescued remained in these, being towed behind the ship. It was in this condition that the mini Schiffer arrived at India Wharf in Boston at 1 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. The public outpouring of support was intense. Many of the people who had traveled on the Connaught had lost everything, and a fund was soon raised for their support. A separate fund was also raised by the survivors of the Connaught for the brave Captain Wilson and his crew for their efforts in ensuring that what could have been a tragic disaster had been averted. The steerage passengers were quickly promised free passage to their destinations by the shipping line as a means of repaying the hardships that they had suffered, and for the loss of their belongings. As a new ship, the Connaught had been fully insured, so the line was able to afford such an expense in the face of their new luxury ship not surviving her second voyage. The last that was seen of the Connaught was by the schooner Lamartine from Nova Scotia, which fell in with the burning steamer on that Sunday night, soon after the Minnie Schiffer had left her. By that time, the Connaught was a mass of flames, but the Lamartine stayed near her until Monday morning around 3, when, with a loud explosion, the Connaught sank below the waves. Only a few trunks and small pieces of deck, as well as an upturned boat, remained on top of the sea, to show that the grand passenger ship had ever existed. The Connaught's short life, size, grandeur, the opulence of her first-class passengers, and cargo that included a shipment of gold coins that had been loaded in St. John's, captured the public imagination. The comparison is made to the Titanic, though thanks to the actions of Captain Wilson, her ending is a much happier story. Still, with a precious cargo that was never recovered, there was a strong desire by some to find her. In 2014, Endurance Exploration Group announced that they had done just that. Her paddle wheels were described as still remaining standing, a haunting reminder of the once grand ship. Though they have never announced her final resting place to the public, and no actions seem to have been taken to bring any part of her to the surface, a court in Florida gave them jurisdiction over the wreck. The gold coins that they can look forward to possibly bringing to the surface someday are almost an afterthought in the newspapers and accounts of the 1860s, however. All that anyone could speak of was the miraculous fact that a ship that had both been sinking and burning at the same time, while full of passengers and away from land, had resulted in no fatalities. For the full statement of Captain Leitch on the sinking of the ship, please see the New York Times article, The Loss of the Connaught, from October 11th, 1860, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.